In the beginning, God created the sun, moon, and stars, the animals, trees, and seas. And he made us his own, and he gave us a garden. And there was beauty and peace and life, but that wasn't enough. And so we sinned and we ate and we fell, and where there was once beauty and peace and life, there was now pain and chaos and death. We went from a garden to a grave. But God promised to bring us back from the grave into the garden. Days, weeks, years, generations of waiting for the promise to come back to the garden. For God so loved the world that he sent Jesus, friend of sinners, man of sorrows, Lord of glory and light of the world, rejected, refused, condemned, and crucified, buried in a borrowed tomb, forsaken and forgotten. But 3 days later, he stepped out of his grave and into a garden. And the same will be true of all who trust him. Where there is pain and chaos and death, there will be beauty and peace and life. Because Jesus is alive, so is hope, so is grace, so is salvation, so is transformation. Because Jesus is alive, we can step out of the grave and into the garden.
Well, happy Easter, everybody. How are we doing? It's great to see you. Welcome to Easter at Restoration Church. If you're joining us online, we're so glad that you are tuning in as well. On behalf of our team and our elders and over 85 servant leaders serving today, thank you for being here. Welcome to our makeshift garden. This is amazing. Christina and her team made this place look so great. We are so glad that you are here. And I don't know about you, I love Easter. I feel like I need Easter more and more each year. Not just the incredible flowers or the pastels or the candy, because I certainly don't need any more of that. But I need the message of resurrection more and more each year. Like, I don't know about you, I need to know that there is more in store than just what I see before me. Especially after these last few years, I feel like all of us are craving this idea. This world that we live in is desperate for resurrection, that we have to believe. We desire to believe. Something in our soul longs to know that there is more in store than just what we see around us. And I don't know about you, I don't know if you call yourself a person of faith, if you're just joining us for Easter. Either way, we're just so glad that you're here. But you've probably had at some point in your life, even if you don't feel all that faithful, a moment where you've wondered, like, does God even care? Does God even hear my prayer? Is God going to do anything about this? Does God care about our world? Or more importantly, if we're honest, to most of us, does God care about me? And if you think about it, when we come to the story of Easter, it's so easy to package it in this pseudo-religious cultural holiday. But actually, the first Easter, the story of Easter actually begins with an unexpected ending. If we're honest about the story of Easter, it wasn't actually much of a celebration that first Easter morning thousands of years ago over in Palestine. Right? We have the privilege of history knowing that Easter Sunday was coming, but for the followers of Jesus and the people even just around him in Jerusalem, it was actually a day of mourning. That they had seen Jesus be killed, and that first Easter morning there were no Christians because there was no Christ. I mean, let's be honest, it's not really Queen without Freddie, right? Like, NSYNC just ceased to exist after Timberlake went solo, and Destiny's Children had a very different destiny without Queen Bee, am I right? Right? And so when Jesus died, they did what all of us would do, and they hit unfollow. I mean, the movement was dead. There was no ham, there was no Easter bunny, there was no celebration. There was some distraught friends, some scared fishermen, fearful for their lives, disappointed that they had wasted an entire season following a carpenter from Nazareth. There were some brave women who decided to still show up to embalm a body that was ruthlessly murdered and hastily buried in a borrowed grave. But they all were wondering, how could they be so gullible? How could they buy into such a ridiculous story that this one would actually be the one that God had promised, that this Jesus could possibly be Messiah that they had heard about since they were kids. I mean, if he really was who he said he was, what seemed like an almost foregone conclusion just a week earlier as they entered into the gates of Jerusalem and everyone proclaiming this is who Jesus is. The celebration was at full clip and they were excited to be in the middle of it. And just 5 days later, instead of leading them to freedom, they watched him led by whip and pain up a hill carrying his own cross to be murdered between two common thieves. Wouldn't he have freed them from political oppression or religious performance? Or at least wouldn't he free himself? I mean, they were ready for their Easter glow up. I mean, they wanted to look as good as y'all do this morning, right? But instead, it was a funeral. It was a day of grief after the unlikely alliance of corrupt temple and a ruthless empire killed their friend and their leader. No one that first Easter morning was at a sunrise service counting down from 10. Because see, they know what you know. They experienced what we've all experienced, and that is that when the worst has happened, God's best is actually really hard to imagine. That when the worst has happened in your life, when she says she's leaving, or when the check doesn't come, or when your child says, no, I'm not interested in a relationship anymore. When the doctor walks in slowly with a clipboard and a frown on his face instead of a smile. When the worst happens, God's best is really hard for us to imagine. And so Jesus' friends went to the tomb, but it wasn't Easter for them. It was just another day of defeat. That the first Easter was a morning of mourning. Nobody expected anything special to happen because they were going to where the body had been laid, and they expected what you and I would expect, that it would still be there. Because dead people do one thing really well. They stay where you put them. And so these women bravely, courageously, against all orders and self-preservation, did something that was really unimaginable after the Passover meal and day of rest had passed. They gathered spices to go to embalm a body that had already been dead for multiple days in someone else's tomb, while all his followers were hiding out in fear for their lives. And yet, Luke, who was a historian who interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people who lived around the time of Jesus, collects all of these eyewitness accounts, these stories, these memories of people who weren't long time ago ancient history recollections. They were here now, like a couple years ago, I was there kind of eyewitness stories. And he catalogs them in what we call the Gospel of Luke. But this was just as recent as a newspaper to most of these people that first read it, that first heard Luke's account. And over years and years, it became legitimized and assured as accurate by people who were there. It's been preserved for us thousands of years later and thousands of miles away. But you have to understand, when people were sharing stories about Jesus, the tales were scrutinized and checked out and fact-checked again and again. And Luke says, this is actually what happened. Like, we could take you to Jerusalem where these things occurred. I can show you where the blood is still dried on the rocks of Golgotha where Jesus died. I can take you to the tomb that they put a stone in front of and sealed it with wax and the imprint of the Roman centurion and placed guards there to make sure that no one could fabricate a tale. And yet that stone that blocked the door wasn't there because Jesus needed an exit strategy, like knocking, hello, got some appointments to make. Like, that stone wasn't to keep Jesus in. It was moved so that you and I could walk in, that you and I could see what God had done. That's exactly what those women discovered when they went to the tomb that morning. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to Luke 24. There's a blue Bible in the seat back pocket directly in front of you if you're here in the room. In that Bible, it's on page 635. I invite you to turn there. If you're watching online, you can just open up another tab. But we say this all the time. If you're here and you have that blue Bible, if you don't have a copy of the scriptures that you can read and understand, right? If it sounds more like Shakespeare and you're like, I'm done with that. That was high school. I'm over it. Like, this Bible is now your Bible. We believe that while complicated, this book has the direction to Jesus, and that leads to life. And so we want you to have a copy that you can read and engage with yourself. So that Bible is now yours. But in Luke 24, he records the account of the first Easter. It said, very early Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb, because let's be honest, if you want something done right, send a woman, right? And they took spices that they had prepared, and they found that the stone that had been placed there had been rolled away from the entrance. And so they went in, which is a little bit courageous, let's be honest, right? Like, I don't know about you, I get spooked really easy, but if I saw a tomb open, I'd be like, oh no, right? But they decided to go in, but they didn't find the body of Jesus. And they stood there puzzled, because that was what they had come to find. That was the reason that they had showed up in the first place. It said, suddenly 2 men appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes, right? So they're in the tomb. They walked in to prepare Jesus, tears still streaming down their face. They cannot believe what has just happened in their life, and yet they're about to be terrified and surprised. And as they see these 2 angels, they bow down with their faces to the ground, and the men ask them this incredibly profound question. Why are you looking among the dead for someone who is alive? Why are you looking for someone who is alive here in a tomb? He isn't here. He is risen from the dead. Remember that he told you back in Galilee that the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, so that he would rise again on the 3rd day. And as they recount this story, as the angels tell them in their grief, they're like, oh, that's right. He did say that. This must be what he meant. And so they rush back from the tomb to tell his 11 disciples and everyone else what had happened. They didn't tell people what they believed, what they wanted. They didn't tell people what they were told, but they recounted what they had seen and heard, what had happened. And you might be thinking, like, come on, Kurt, we can't really trust the Bible. Like, it's obviously written to convince us of something, right? But hold on for just a second. If you were trying to start a religion to coerce and control people for the rest of human history, wouldn't you make yourself the hero of the story? I mean, most religions, that's actually what they do. That someone, usually a man, has some incredibly profound insight into the things of God, and so follow him. Do what he says and give him lots of money. Like, come to my thing. I know how God really works, and I'll tell you how it is. If you bring your credit card, right, that's normally how religion goes. And there's no one that, especially in the first century, would write this story if they were trying to convince people of something that wasn't true, because it just didn't check out. Women were not even credible witnesses in court, and no one would actually make themselves the person that, said, oh, I totally didn't think this was going to happen. Like no one in any of the gospel accounts writes themselves into the story as the one that's like, you know what, everybody else kind of gave up, but I kind of believed. Like, I kind of held on to the end. No, everyone lost hope, because you would too, and so would I. Because what they had seen, what had happened to their leader, was so horrendous, so disorienting, so crushingly defeating that there was nothing else they could do but give up. And so as Luke writes these stories, even these accounts, 15, 20 years after they had happened, they still include that they were wrong. You know what? My assumption, as rational as I thought, was inaccurate. Because 3 days in the darkness of the tomb, the darkness of death, and the panic of persecution in the followers of Jesus had rule of the day. The followers fled. They returned to fishing boats, hiding in their homes, waiting for who knows what, because to them, the story was over. And so the angels asked them a question, an honest question, because it's exactly what they were doing. And I think the question is the one that we should ask ourselves as well, is why are you looking for the living among the dead. I can just imagine they're showing up with spices to give their last rites and honor their Savior. And the angel's just like, girl, he gone. Like, what are you doing? Why are you looking for him? This isn't where he is anymore. Temporarily, yes, but just as he told you, there's more in store. And the question for you and for me is, why do I keep looking for life in dead ends? Like, are there places in your life and your journey where you just kind of keep going back to them and you know that they're never going to satisfy? They overpromise, sure, but they always underdeliver. Whether it's chasing money or applause, promotions or career, sex or relationships, you can scroll all day and never be satisfied, never find what you're searching for. You keep looking to feel better, but you just find yourself feeling worse. And don't miss this, right? You can go hard after religion and work hard to be the best person you can, to know all the answers and sing all the songs, and yet you just find yourself more depleted and defeated than when you started. Because none of those things can do what Jesus did. The Apostle Paul, before he met Jesus, was so convinced of his religious reputation that was it. That was what's going to, make him stand before God with some sort of something to offer, some pride, some prowess. And he certainly had a lot of self-righteousness for the people around him that weren't quite as good as him at religion. And then he meets Jesus and realizes that all his performance was nothing compared to the presence of the resurrected Savior. Because the only one who can offer real life is the one who actually defeated death. The only one to ever defeat death is the only one that can give you and me real life. And when Paul discovered this, he began telling everyone that he could find about Jesus. And he had a lot of credibility because they knew who he was before. Isn't that interesting? Like maybe you invited someone to Easter this week, or you're going to go over and talk to friends or family, and you're like, you can tell them you came to church and be like, oh, you? You went to church? And it's still there? Like it didn't burn down when you walk in? You're like, no, they got flowers everywhere. It was great, right? I mean, that was Paul's situation, right? Like everybody knew him before. And so when he tells them about Jesus, they were surprised. And he puts it this way to a group of people trying to follow Jesus in a letter that he wrote to them in the city of Galatia, which was a strong-willed, self-made type of city that really prided themselves on what they knew about all things mystical and spiritual. And he says this way in Galatians 2:20, it says, my old self, that old way of living, that thing that overpromised and underdelivered, that has been crucified with Christ. And it's no longer I who live, but it's Christ who actually lives in me. And so I live, yes, in this earthly body, but it's by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul would say Jesus' death wasn't an accident, and it wasn't even something that anyone did to him, but it was like something that he gave of himself because of his great love, not just for his immediate followers, but for all people. And that would have been a nice story if it ended the way most stories do. If after he was beaten and nailed to a cross, even offering forgiveness with his last breath, like that's sweet. But as he's buried in the tomb, even still, the story's over. I mean, there's no coming back from that. Unless, from deep within the earth, the heart of a dead man began to beat again. Unless a lifeless and breathless body began to breathe again. And what Paul came to recognize, and what I've come to recognize, and many around you, and maybe for you today, I hope you come to recognize, is that the corpse of the Creator arose and traded the suffocation of death for lungs full of life. He traded the burden of the law for the scandal of grace. He traded the constricting grave clothes of religious performance for actual freedom in his presence through a personal relationship with God. An open, welcoming, eternal, restored reality made possible because of resurrection. I mean, there really was no other way. And so whether you're sinner or saint, single mother or forgotten brother, whether you're an unwanted daughter or you're without a father, whether you're black, white, Latin, Asian, broken or whole, weak or strong, even when you feel like you've been told you don't belong, Easter speaks to you saying resurrection is for everyone. That a new day is made possible for you and freedom has come. Love is alive and a new day has dawned. Not just like any other day with the same old constrictions and the same old fears. Not just another day with the old outlook based on the same old circumstances, but a new one that's full of promise and renewal, redemption and restoration for you and for me. That once and for all, Jesus' resurrection shows you and I how far God would go, how far his grace went for the human race, so that you, whether you believe it or not, can have a fresh start, can have a new day. See, Jesus made a way so that you and I could have a new day. That first morning, what we call Easter, was a reality-changing experience. That every person throughout the centuries, since those first women who discovered the amazing story that Jesus, in fact, had come back to life, they saw it with their own eyes. He was no longer there. They have been changed by his love. And they realize what I hope and pray you realize this morning, that Jesus was not bringing an updated spin on our outdated religion. He was not bringing a new version of an old system. But that Jesus' presence on this planet was evidence that God might actually be different than maybe even what we had been taught. And in fact, God's love for you is even greater, even better than you thought. So what does that mean for you? Like in your world right now, with your stress and your questions, with your struggles, with your education, with your bills, with your kids, is this Easter just like all the others? Or is it possible that Jesus might have something special for you today? That this Easter would in fact be a new day. See, because that's the problem with resurrection, right? Is you can't really take it back. Like once someone has come back from the dead, there's not really much else to debate. I mean, miracles can be fabricated, magic can be an illusion or sleight of hand, and great teachers and religious leaders certainly are a dime a dozen. It was true then and it's true today. But perhaps this Easter, Jesus wants to do something new for you. That whether you would consider yourself a convinced believer or a coerced skeptic, like you were promised brunch after, right? Whether you've been faithful, half full, or if you're honest, you come to this Easter this morning feeling a little faithless, maybe, just maybe, instead of the religious notion and the add-on that you've been taught Jesus was, there's something new for you as you look to the person of Jesus. Because if someone can predict their own death and resurrection and then actually pull it off, I mean, I think we should listen to what he has to say. And Jesus says God is for you. That God has done something for you because he loves you. That Jesus says he was raised to life so that you can have hope. So that you can have life and purpose and meaning. That you can have a friendship with God and a fresh start. That because of Jesus, that we don't have to live in the regrets and the fears and the heartbreaks of yesterday, but a new day is dawning, one that we can say hello to peace and joy and love and strength and hope. Because of Jesus, there's a new day for you on the horizon.